Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're highlighting the world's most captivating mysteries that were finally solved. And we're starting with creepy American mysteries that were ultimately put to rest.
I see my grandfather holding up something that he knew that wasn't what he found.
He was adamant that this was not what he saw in the debris field.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're looking at 10 creepiest American mysteries that were finally solved.
There's this extraordinary sense that this rock shouldn't be there. Somehow it moved.
For this list, we'll be looking at long, enduring mysteries from the United States that were eventually explained. Do you find any of these answers satisfying? The Umbrella Man. The assassination of John F. Kennedy is an enduringly popular subject for conspiracy theories, and one of the most popular involved the so-called Umbrella Man.
There are other still photographs taken from other locations in Dealey Plaza which show the whole man standing under an open black umbrella.
Found in various photos and films, he raised suspicion not only for his use of an umbrella on a sunny day, but for his positioning near Kennedy when he was shot. Naturally, many people began to suspect that he was somehow involved.
There was one wingnut who published a book with a diagram of the umbrella. The umbrella was rigged so that there was an aiming device.
This remained a mystery for 15 years. It wasn't until 1978 that a man named Louis Stephen Witt came forward and identified himself as the man in question. And there was no grand conspiracy. The Umbrella Man was a mere symbol of political protest, and he just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
It was a protest at the appeasement policies of Joseph P. Kennedy, John Kennedy's father.
Carina White. In 2011, Nadra Nance discovered that her real name was Carina White. The story goes back to August 4th, 1987, when the 19-day-old White was abducted from Manhattan's Harlem Hospital.
She was snatched out of her hospital crib by a stranger. The family claims it was a mystery woman who had been hanging around the hospital for weeks, disguised as a nurse.
The perpetrator was Anugeta Petway, who was desperate for a child of her own and raised White as Nedra Nance. The kidnapping remained unsolved for over 2 decades, and it was White herself who cracked the case.
She wasn't sure exactly why she belonged to that family. There was things like there wasn't physical similarities and stuff like that. Then there was no paperwork to follow her, such as a birth certificate or a social security card. So in her late teens, she became suspicious of who she was.
She eventually deduced that Petway was not her biological mother, and found through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children that she was actually the missing Carina White.
I just always believed that she would find me. That was something that I always believed in myself, that she would come and find me.
A DNA match proved this in 2011, and Petway served nearly 10 years in prison for the kidnapping. The Florida Sinkhole. South of Tallahassee, Florida is the Osceola River, and inside the Osceola River is a massive sinkhole. No one wanted to dive into the sinkhole as, according to scientist Jesse Halligan, it was as dark as the inside of a cow, with literally no light at all.
It looks very primitive, and there's gators and snakes, and you feel like you're in the middle of nowhere, literally, even though you're about 40 miles from Tallahassee.
But fortune favors the brave, and Halligan decided to head in. What she found was utterly fascinating. Inside the sinkhole were ancient stone tools and mastodon bones bearing evidence of human activity, indicating that we had been in the southeastern United States for at least 14,500 years.
When we went back, what we found was a stone tool that could not have been made by nature, that was definitely cultural, that dated to 14,550 years ago.
This is about 1,500 years earlier than had been believed. And with other forms of evidence, it raises major questions about the initial colonization of America.
It's great because we took a site from an ambiguous status to now we've got to reinvestigate everything we thought we knew about the first Americans with one little stone tool.
Pamela Jackson and Cheryl Miller. Back in 1971, teenagers Pamela Jackson and Cheryl Miller were driving to a party at a local gravel pit when they disappeared.
The Vermilion teenagers were last seen driving a 1960 Studebaker Lark, trying to find a rural keg party in Vermilion.
Jackson and Miller were driving behind some classmates on their way to the pits, but the driver of that vehicle eventually realized that they were no longer being followed. Despite an extensive search, no evidence of the car or the students was found. It seemed like their vehicle simply up and vanished. In 2004, police reopened the case and indicted David Licken for murdering the girls, but there wasn't enough evidence to hold the charge.
3 search warrants on the Licken farm uncovered what police detailed as evidence. That evidence, Raghu shows in his book, wasn't really evidence at all.
It wasn't until September 2013 that a drought dried a local creek and revealed the long, rusted car. Authorities believe that the car somehow went off the road and crashed into the creek, killing its 2 occupants.
A local man by the name of Jim Sorensen discovered the 1960 Studebaker Lark in Bruley Creek. The teens weren't murdered by the Lickens, as South Dakota DCI team said. They died in a tragic car accident.
The Death Valley Sailing Stones. As if the name Death Valley wasn't creepy enough, it also hosts one of the eeriest natural phenomena in the country.
But these weird moving rocks are not a new phenomenon. They've been happening on the dry lake bed for so long, locals call it racetrack playa.
Found along the smooth valley floor are heavy rocks with clear drag marks behind them. However, there's no evidence of human activity. So what exactly dragged these rocks across the dirt? Or who? We would love to say aliens.
One of the claims on how these rocks mysteriously move is electromagnetic fields generated by UFOs.
But like many natural mysteries, there's a pretty simple answer behind the sailing stones. A very thin sheet of ice forms on the valley floor in the winter, and when the ice melts in the morning sun, the rocks slide across the slippery surface. We know. Boring.
Boring.
The Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot film. When it comes to evidence of cryptids, it's hard to beat the legendary Patterson-Gimlin film. Shot in Northern California in 1967, it shows what is supposedly Bigfoot walking in a stream bed.
When I first saw her, she was standing upright. I thought, you know, this is unreal.
Now, this is admittedly some very good footage, and debate continues to rage regarding its authenticity. But there is just too much proof that debunks it. A costume maker named Philip Morris has revealed that he sold an ape suit to Patterson in 1967.
Costume manufacturer Philip Morris claimed just that in this video. He gave talks about how he sold Patterson the suit worn in the film.
Another man named Bob Hieronymus claimed to be the man in the suit. Author Greg Long has found circumstantial evidence alleging that Patterson was a known hoaxer. Even Gimlin claimed there could have been the possibility of a hoax on the part of Patterson.
I made a lot of mistakes about different things that they asked me when they first saw the film and then asked me about the film.
The Olympic Park Criminal. Eric Rudolph committed a series of bombings across the southern United States in the late 90s, injuring well over 100 people and killing 3, one of which suffered an indirect heart attack.
Eric Rudolph wanted to send a message. Radicalized by his religious ideology, Rudolph appointed himself as the man who'd fight the federal government in the war to end abortion.
His most famous act was the Centennial Olympic Park bombing, which occurred during the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta. The bomb went off at 1:20 a.m., killing 2 people and injuring 111.
Rudolph's pipe bomb at the 1996 Olympics was meant to end the games.
The unknown perpetrator remained a fugitive and committed other bombings throughout 1997 and 98. Various clues included a partial license plate, eventually identified the bomber as Eric Rudolph, and he was placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. It wasn't until 2003 that he was arrested while dumpster diving in North Carolina.
It was not effective in terms of the goals that he had in mind, because everything is happening exactly the opposite of what he hoped would happen.
The Roswell incident. You all know the story. In July 1947, a UFO crashed into Roswell, New Mexico, and the government covered it up by saying it was a weather balloon.
US Army changed its story, saying it was a harmless, high-altitude weather balloon, not a grounded flying disc.
But did you know that this story wasn't widely accepted until the late 1970s? For 3 decades, the American populace accepted the truth. The device really was just a balloon. Now, it wasn't exactly a weather balloon, and this discrepancy has only lent credence to the conspiracy theorists.
Why did the Roswell Army Air Force initially fuel speculation about discs?
Rather, it was a balloon from Project Mogul, a top-secret government program that utilized the tools to spy on Soviets. The fact was officially confirmed in 1994 by the United States Air Force following an inquiry by the General Accounting Office.
Roswell debris was part of a different kind of balloon, one used in the top-secret Project Mogul. Essentially an airborne bugging device to listen out for possible Soviet nuclear tests and missile launches.
The Golden State Killer. For many years, the Golden State Killer went by a variety of different names, including the Visalia Ransacker and the Night Stalker.
Pure evil strikes the heart of California.
He was able to spot weakness, almost like a predator, which this guy is, make no mistake.
The man who stalked and attacked dozens of victims for years.
His crimes lasted for a period of 12 years between 1974 and 1986, in which he committed over 50 sexual assaults and 13 murders. He even taunted the local police by making obscene phone calls. But despite this direct line of communication, he was never caught. That is, until 2018, when the perpetrator was 72 years old. Through the use of DNA and genetic genealogy, investigators were able to identify the criminal as Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer and truck mechanic of California. D'Angelo was finally sentenced to life in prison nearly 50 years after his crime spree began.
Former police officer Joseph D'Angelo Jr. sentenced to life with no parole.
The Vampire Clan. Unsolved Mysteries is full of creepy tales, but none quite as unsettling as the Vampire Clan.
On the internet, vampire chat rooms attract thousands of hits every day. And players of various games such as Vampire the Masquerade gather regularly to act out their dark dramas.
On November 25, 1996, someone entered the home of Naomi and Richard Wendorf and beat them to death with a crowbar. Their bodies were later discovered by their daughter, Jennifer. Suspicion immediately fell to a so-called vampire clan led by one Rod Farrell, as Jennifer's sister Heather had been friendly with the group.
Phone records show that Heather had been calling Rod for several months. Rod claims that Heather asked him to come to Florida to kill her parents.
It was said that Farrell made prospective members drink his blood in order to join the cult. Just a few weeks after the episode aired, the grandmother of a member called the police and told them where the cult was heading. They were apprehended in Louisiana, and Farrell was sentenced to life in prison.
Farrell was sentenced to death anyway, despite implying that he was acting for a friend. It was a death sentence which was changed years later to life in prison because of law changes regarding the sentencing of teenage defendants in Florida.
Now that we've seen American mysteries that have finally been given answers, it's time to check out their eerie Canadian counterparts.
We have now some closure, and that was very, very important to get.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're looking at chilling mysteries located in or involving citizens of Canada that are generally considered to be solved.
But the breakthrough came last year using DNA testing and genealogy.
The Toronto homicides. Between 2010 and 2017, 8 men with ties to Church and Wellesley, Toronto's LGBTQIA+ village, were killed by an unknown assailant. Fear spread across the queer community, with many believing a serial killer was to blame.
Years after rumors started swirling that a serial killer was stalking the gay village.
Ultimately, those fears were confirmed. The resulting investigation was the most extensive ever undertaken by the Toronto Police Service. It spawned 2 special task forces and involved a number of entities, including the TPS, Ontario Provincial Police, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police.
Police set up a task force, Project Houston, to find any links between the missing men. They find none, but MacArthur is hiding in plain sight.
Eventually, police connected several victims to landscaper Bruce MacArthur, a man with a violent past who spent time in Church and Wellesley and knew how to exploit an already vulnerable community. It took over 5 years, but MacArthur was finally apprehended in 2018 and sentenced to life imprisonment.
In what came down to a symbolic decision, the judge ordered MacArthur serve his sentences concurrently, or all at once. If he's still alive, MacArthur will be 91 when he can apply for parole in 25 years.
The disappearance of Terror and Erebus. This one's a different sort of mystery from the others on the list, but nonetheless harrowing. It was 1845, and British Royal Navy officer John Franklin was tasked with exploring the Northwest Passage in modern-day Nunavut. He and his crew left the UK aboard 2 ships, HMS Terror and HMS Erebus.
The crew feels ready to embark. They set out for the Northwest Passage in high spirits.
But after 3 long years of silence, a rescue party was sent to find the missing expedition. It was presumed that the ships were lost and everybody had died. Throughout the subsequent century, we've since learned that the ships got stuck in pack ice.
An Inuit historian and teacher named Louis Kamukak shares specific stories passed down by his ancestors with the Canadian government, providing the missing pieces to the 170-year-old puzzle.
Modern studies that began in the 1980s also uncovered that everyone died of a variety of issues, including a lack of nutritious food, hypothermia, and disease. What's more, some crew members highly likely engaged in cannibalism as a last resort. Meanwhile, the sunken Erebus was found by Parks Canada in 2014, and Terror was spotted 2 years later.
Inside his cabin, a work desk dominates the center of the room, with sealed drawers that almost certainly contain essential information about the Franklin expedition.
Nadine Machiskinek. Back in January of 2015, the body of Nadine Machiskinek was found laying at the bottom of a laundry chute inside Regina's Delta Motel.
The jury heard the 911 call to EMS from hotel staff who had clearly and wrongly assumed Machiskinek stumbled into the basement laundry room and did not fall down the chute.
Machiskinek was still alive and rushed to the hospital, but she unfortunately died of her extensive injuries. However, a number of mysteries surrounded the death. For example, some wondered how she fit inside such a small opening, and others questioned the involvement of 2 men who can be seen with Machiskinek on security footage.
I could understand why they would have went with accidental, because it's an easy investigation to say, oh, we found somebody laying on the floor with a pill bottle beside them. Case closed. That it's so much easier to rule out an accident than to actually dig hard and do investigative work.
It was eventually ruled that the death was accidental, and Machiskinek was found with a number of drugs in her system. While the RCMP criticized the investigative work of the Regina Police Service, the case was nevertheless closed with this otherwise simple answer.
Mistakes were made, delays happened in 2 or 3 different instances, but it wasn't because of the person. Yeah. It was because of some process pieces on our end as a service.
Arrested 40 years later. Back in 1983, Toronto women Susan Tice and Erin Gilmore were assaulted and killed by an unknown assailant.
Both were killed in 1983 in their homes, just kilometers apart.
While they lived in close proximity, the victims did not know each other, and their deaths occurred months apart, with Tice's in August and Gilmore's in December. The cases quickly went cold, although a breakthrough came in 2000 when it was discovered that the same perp had killed both victims.
In 2000, police announced DNA linked both women to the same killer. It took 22 more years to figure out who that DNA belonged to.
However, it wasn't until 2019 that a suspect was finally named thanks to the work of investigative genetic genealogy. Using DNA and an extensive family tree, investigators were able to nail Moosonee man Joseph Sutherland as the killer.
Researchers successfully identified an unknown suspect's great-grandparents. They hired genealogists and worked their way through the family tree to then eventually obtain a sample from Sutherland, and then got the match and then made that arrest.
He was arrested in 2022, nearly 40 years after the murders occurred. Adrian McColl. A large majority of murders are committed by people close to the deceased. According to the Bureau of Justice, 76% of female victims are killed by someone they know. That included Adrian McColl. McColl's body was found in a ditch on February 17, 2002, with evidence showing that she had been violently killed.
Adrian's body was discovered in a ditch near Nanton. No clue how she got there, no clue who brought her.
Unfortunately, the trail quickly went cold, and it remained as such for many years. But thanks to technological advancements, police later identified McColl's then-boyfriend Stéphane Perrin as the killer.
And he has been the person of interest in this case for the past 16 years. Superintendent Garrett Woolsey revealing today that it is advances in DNA that has finally brought this case to the courts.
Perrin was arrested exactly 16 years after McColl's body was found, on February 17, 2018. He was sentenced to life in prison in 2022.
The
just remember my hand shaking, and I put the phone down, and I just said, they got him.
The Windsor hum. Annoying and persistent humming has been reported all around the world. New Mexico's Taos hum is a famous one, and Canada saw its own version with the Windsor hum.
It's like a very low, almost like a vibration. You think you hear it, but it could be your mind playing tricks on you.
Residents of the city complained of an irritating droning noise, with some even reporting a low-frequency vibration that shook their houses.
It's one that keeps them up at night and rattles their windows, and it's been loud enough to crack eggs.
Unfortunately, no one knew where it was coming from. That said, most people suspected Zug Island, a beautifully named industrial area of Detroit. Sure enough, they were correct. U.S. Steel operated on the island, and they shut down the blast furnaces in April of 2020.
And you can hear it. You can hear this horrible noise. This is a restricted area defined by Homeland Security regulations.
Once that happened, the hum suddenly stopped, and no complaints have been made since. The Babes in the Wood. It was January 14th, 1953 when 2 bodies were found in Vancouver's Stanley Park. The corpses were laid in a prearranged manner and found with a hatchet, leading investigators to conclude that they were murdered.
A weapon found near their bodies, which were hidden under a woman's coat.
Unfortunately, that was all we knew for a long, long time. It was initially believed that one of the victims was female, but a DNA test done in 1998 proved that both were male.
Originally, police believed the victims were a boy and a girl, until the late 90s when Detective Brian Honeyborn brought the remains to Dr. David Sweet at UBC.
Not only that, they were brothers. However, we wouldn't get an official ID until 2022. Using genetic genealogy, the brothers were found to be Derek and David Dalton, who were respectively born in 1940 and 1941. Their killer remains unknown, but getting an ID 70 years after the fact is certainly worth celebrating.
Vancouver police admit they may never learn why Derek and David were killed or who killed them, but they vow to keep trying.
The Nation River Lady. For many years, Jewel Langford was known simply as the Nation River Lady. Her remains were dumped from a bridge in Castleman, Ontario, and deposited into the Nation River, where they were found in May of 1975.
The 48-year-old Tennessee woman went missing in 1975, soon after moving to Montreal. Police investigated, but the case went cold.
Langford was a tourist from Tennessee, and she was declared missing after failing to return home. Her status remained unchanged for 4 decades, until a major break in the case occurred in 2019. It was then that investigators exhumed her remains and gave them a new round of DNA tests.
I was contacted by the local FBI here, and they asked me if I would be willing to give DNA. They had a body that they thought might be our missing aunt. We were told that it was a match.
Once again, using forensic genealogy, they were able to officially link them to Langford, making this the first Canadian case in which remains were identified using the advanced method.
And the DNA sample was linked with others through a genealogy and family tree analysis. Work was done to meet with the relatives, the surviving relatives of Ms. Langford, and obtain a number of DNA samples.
The real killer of Christine Jessop. Queensville, Ontario's Christine Jessop was kidnapped and killed back in 1984. The 9-year-old went missing in October, and her remains were found over 30 miles away in December.
By the 30th anniversary of Christine's death, hope of finding the killer was fading.
Her neighbor, Guy Paul Morin, was initially suspected and eventually convicted of her death in 1992. Morin remained in prison for over 2 years until DNA evidence officially exonerated him in January of 1995.
She said her brother's eventual acquittal didn't provide enough closure for many, but now there is no doubt.
Morin's release prompted the publication of the Kaufman Report, which resulted in a major overhaul of Canadian policing methods. Luckily, the real killer was identified in 2020, once again using genetic genealogy. He was 28-year-old Calvin Hoover, a family friend of the Jessops who initially helped search for the missing girl. Unfortunately, justice could not be served, as Hoover died in 2015.
If he were alive today, the Toronto Police Service would arrest Calvin Hoover.
The 28-year-old was a neighbor and friend of the Jessop family.
Sharron Prior. Hailing from Montreal, Sharron Prior left her home to meet some friends for pizza. She never returned. 3 days later, her body was found in the woods.
Life has not been easy for us since then, but Sharron has given us strength for the past 48 years, and especially today.
This case occurred back in 1975, and it remained unsolved for nearly 50 years. A man's shirt was used to bound Prior, and from this, investigators took a DNA sample. Using the modern magic of genetic genealogy, investigators traced this DNA to a man named Franklin Romine.
For police who worked to solve the case, they say there was a real sense of excitement when they started to realize they had actually identified the killer.
Unfortunately, Romine had long been dead, having passed away in 1982. His remains were exhumed in 2023 and matched with the DNA found at the crime scene.
They say new investigative techniques led them to Romine, an American who died 7 years after the murder.
After 48 years, the killer of Sharron Prior was finally identified. What do you make of these answers to these mysteries?
Something I'll never forget. Been waiting, and we've all been waiting 39 years for that call.
When it comes to these upcoming murder mysteries, justice may have been delayed, but it was not denied.
I realize I'm looking at the name of most likely the murderer, and I'm the only person in the world who knows it.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're counting down our picks for the top 10 murder mysteries that were finally solved.
It's a needle in a haystack, but the needle's in there somewhere, and it's our job to find it.
For this list, we'll be looking at infamous fatal cold cases that took years until the culprit was discovered, finally closing the investigation. Which incidents did we miss? Let us know below. Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. In November 1987, Canadian couple Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg took a business trip to Seattle, Washington.
According to their ferry ticket, Jay and Tanya got to the dock in downtown Seattle around midnight. They were going to sleep in the van, then return home the next day. But by the following evening, they still hadn't arrived back home, and they hadn't called.
However, on the 24th, Van Cuylenborg's body was found near Alger, Washington. 2 days later, Cook's body was located in Snohomish County, nearly 60 miles away. As Van Cuylenborg had been assaulted, DNA evidence was kept, but no one was brought to justice.
But there was no forensic evidence linking Jay's death to anyone else, and no match between the DNA found on Tanya's body and any law enforcement database.
Until 2018 anyway. Investigators used the online service GEDmatch, uploaded the DNA from Van Cuylenborg's clothes, and found a match from multiple sources. This led them to arrest the profile's cousin, William Earl Talbot II, after matching his sample with a cup he had dropped. In 2019, he was found guilty and received 2 life sentences.
For the families, this was closure.
For my family and I, it is our first day without the weight, the burden.
Anna Jean Kane. In October 1988, the body of Anna Jean Kane was located within the Antolani Trail in Perry Township, Pennsylvania. She had been strangled and placed in the wooded area.
Police say a man who lives nearby was walking along the trail and saw Anna's body about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday. But detectives do not believe this was the scene of the crime.
DNA evidence from her clothes was stored by the police. By 1990, the local newspaper, the Reading Eagle, called for information on the killing. They received an anonymous letter that contained intimate details that led the cops to believe this person was responsible for Kane's slaying.
Reading Eagle received an anonymous letter signed from a concerned citizen that had numerous intimate details about the homicide.
In 2022, the DNA evidence matched the saliva on the envelope that sent the disturbing note. The Parabon Nano Labs in Virginia used the profile to link it to Scott Grimm, who had been arrested in 2002 for another crime. However, he passed away in 2018.
The fact that he is deceased, he will never face justice, as we all would hope, but we solved it. We gave some closure to the family.
Janet Love. In April 1986, an assailant entered the apartment of Janet Love in Bedford, Texas, assaulted her, then fatally shot her.
Love was working the 3 to midnight shift at DFW Airport.
She had come home from that shift, and that's when we believe she was attacked.
While the police followed several leads, they couldn't find the person responsible. Yet they kept the DNA evidence and entered it into the FBI Combined DNA Index System, also known as CODIS. In 2020, with help from the University of North Texas, genealogists put a profile together on the culprit, Ray Anthony Chapa.
Says Chapa held a string of odd jobs over the years and had a criminal history that included theft and drug possession.
He had lived near Love in 1986, just 1,000 feet away. However, in January 2021, Chapa passed away from a terminal illness. Regardless, the police believed he had committed other crimes since he lived in Illinois and Montana and began investigating this possibility.
None of it's going to bring her back, but it is
some sense of justice.
Joette Smith. In March 1983, the body of Joette Smith was located in the San Lorenzo River near Ben Lomond, California, where she was the owner of the restaurant Buffalo Gals.
On March 29, 1983, Smith was found dead in the San Lorenzo River in Ben Lomond.
The local community was devastated by the popular businesswoman's demise. While police interviewed many people, there were no suspects. But in 1988, Eric David Drummond came up in the investigation.
They learned that Smith had turned down a man who turned out to be the suspect when he asked her out. Still, that was all circumstantial.
He had apparently asked Smith on a date and was rejected. However, there was no evidence of his involvement in her end, until 2022, that is. Using new technology, a DNA profile from Smith's clothes was created that matched Drummond, who had a history of assault crimes. Yet before he could be arrested, Drummond took his own life.
We thought we might have the small chance of solving it with DNA technology, and then it ended up working out for us. So I think it gives us a lot of momentum going forward, a lot of
Maurice Chivarella. In March 1964, Maurice Chivarella walked to school in Hazleton, Pennsylvania. Sadly, this was the last time the young girl was seen alive, as her body was discovered later the same day in a coal mine pit.
She went on her way toward the school. She was never seen alive again. Later that day, her body was found in a coal stripping pit about 2 miles away.
Chivarella had been kidnapped, assaulted, and slain. Sadly, the police were unable to find the person responsible. Years later, the DNA found on Chivarella's clothes was uploaded to an online database.
In 2019, the state police unveiled these images of a possible suspect at various ages, 25, 40, and 60. It is based on DNA technology used on evidence from the crime scene.
In 2020, work from a genealogist and then 18-year-old student Eric Schubert discovered a lead, a distant cousin. This led investigators to James Fort. However, he passed away in 1980 at the age of 38 from natural causes. In 2022, Fort's body was exhumed and the DNA matched.
That sample provided the final piece needed to confirm Fort was indeed the killer.
Everything that had to go right did. We just kept trucking forward with these really small DNA matches until we got the big fish.
Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky. In January 1956, Lloyd Dwayne Bogle was found fatally shot next to his car in Great Falls, Montana.
The victim was Dwayne Bogle. Dwayne was from Texas. He was an airman at Malmstrom Air Force Base.
The following day, the body of Patricia Kalitsky was discovered. The teenage couple was seemingly slain by the same person. The police followed many leads, including notorious gangster Whitey Bulger, but nothing concrete was established.
Whitey Bulger was a known killer who had potentially murdered numerous people, and during our research, we found that he was in Great Falls in the 1950s.
In 2001, investigators created a DNA profile of the suspect found in Kalitsky's autopsy. Years later, a match was found on genealogy websites with a distant relative. This led the cops to Kenneth Gould, who grew up near Kalitsky's home. However, Gould was cremated in 2007, so in 2021, the police tested his children and found Gould was the culprit for this grim 65-year-old crime.
DNA technology eventually led to Gould. 3 of his children would consent to submitting a DNA sample, resulting in a match.
Rita Curran. In July 1971, a roommate discovered the body of schoolteacher Rita Curran in their apartment in Burlington, Vermont.
The young teacher was murdered just 2 weeks after moving out of her parents' home into an apartment.
There were signs she had been assaulted before her demise. The police suspected that infamous serial killer Ted Bundy was responsible, as he was born in the area. However, he denied it, and there was no proof.
The case unsolved for decades until now, thanks to how meticulous investigators were back then.
In 2014, DNA from a cigarette butt at the scene was analyzed. Unfortunately, neither the National Crime Database nor the main suspects matched the profile. In 2022, the cigarette, along with additional DNA from Curran's clothes, was examined by genealogy experts. This led to a match to William DeRuse, a neighbor to Curran, whose then wife gave a false alibi for.
He turned to Michelle and asked her and told her that if the police ever showed up again, she was to tell him that he was home all night because he had a criminal history, and if they knew he was out, they would come after him for this.
DeRuse, however, passed away in 1983. Shannon Rose Lloyd and Renee Cuevas. In May 1987, Shannon Rose Lloyd was assaulted and slain in her bedroom in Garden Grove, California.
In May of 1987, 23-year-old Shannon Lloyd was found murdered in Garden Grove inside her own bedroom.
In February 1989, Renee Cuevas' body was located near the Marine Corps Air Station in El Toro, now known as Lake Forest. In both of these crimes, neither perpetrator was discovered. It wasn't until 2003 that these two cases were connected together. In 2021, the Orange County District Attorney's investigative genetic genealogy team found that DNA evidence from the murders was linked to Reuben J. Smith, who lived in the area in the 80s.
Reuben Smith was identified using genetic genealogy.
Investigators say the first piece of the puzzle came from Smith himself, who was forced to give his DNA in 1998.
In 1998, he was arrested for assault and attempted murder. As such, his DNA was on file. However, in 1999, Smith took his own life.
The wound was closed, and then when we get the call, it opens up all again.
BTK. From the outside, Dennis Rader seemed like a nice, normal person. After all, he had a family and was high up in the local church and a Cub Scout leader.
When you look at his lifestyle, I mean, he really didn't fit the profile of a serial killer. I mean, he blended in. You know, the president of his church congregation, Boy Scout leader, you know, lived in the suburbs outside of Wichita. I mean, he blended in.
But behind the scenes, he had taken the lives of 10 people in Wichita and Park City, Kansas from 1974 to 1991. Calling himself BTK, the serial killer anonymously sent letters to the cops and media about his horrid crimes. In 2004, Rader contacted authorities again. By the following year, Rader sent a floppy drive to the media to taunt them more.
A local news station receives yet another package from the BTK killer. Inside it, the item police had been hoping for, a computer disk.
Instead, they found metadata on the drive that linked it to his church and contained his name. In August 2005, Rader was found guilty of the 10 murders and was sentenced to 175 years.
Judge Gregory Waller sentences Dennis Rader to the maximum allowed, 10 consecutive life sentences.
The Golden State Killer. In 2001, the police discovered that the original Night Stalker and a serial assaulter that had terrorized areas around Sacramento, California, were in fact the same person.
You started looking at the devastation that this guy wrought. You're taunting the police, you're taunting the population, and you're never caught.
In 2013, he was given the moniker of the Golden State Killer, who had been on a rampage of crimes from 1974 to 1986, including 120 burglaries, 51 assaults, and 13 slayings. Along the way, through phone calls, he mocked the police as they struggled to find him.
Desperate to capture him, investigators literally chased down thousands of leads.
In 2018, a new genetic genealogy technique linked the Golden State Killer DNA from Joseph James D'Angelo through family members who had willingly uploaded their profiles to databases.
New technology was D'Angelo's downfall. The Golden State Killer's genetic profile had been plugged into the genealogical website gedmatch.com, and it returned a link to genetic material stored there by one of D'Angelo's relatives.
In 2020, the former police officer was sentenced to life in prison for his horrendous criminal history.
We're about to journey back in time to unlock the mysteries of World War II, revealing many wartime secrets.
It is just mind-blowing to think where we started and where things are right now.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're unlocking the greatest secrets of one of the most tumultuous periods in history.
The carburetor froze up, the plane crashed into the English Channel. End of story.
Number 10. The disappearance of Andrew Ladner. Private Ladner was a proud son of Mississippi who was shipped off to the Pacific in 1942. During the Battle of Bunagana, Ladner was on a mission in the jungles of New Guinea. Sadly, Ladner was killed in action.
And during a battle in New Guinea in 1942, Ladner was killed at just the age of 30.
Unfortunately, the American Graves Registration Service was unable to locate his remains when they combed the battlefield 8 years later. As it turns out, that's because his remains were discovered in 1943. Listed as an unknown soldier, Ladner was buried in a nearby village.
He was then buried there, and his remains were never identified until about a year ago.
After POW and MIA organizations conducted a review of unidentified remains, his body was exhumed, and a 2016 DNA test confirmed his identity. After more than 70 years, they finally brought Private Ladner home.
His family was then notified and decided to have him brought to Mississippi, where he will be honorably buried at a family plot.
Number 9. Missing German vehicle. One of the very few positive consequences of climate change is that sometimes droughts uncover archaeological treasures. That's exactly what happened in 2022 in Sermide, Italy. As the Germans retreated from the region in 1945, a British recon plane spotted a German half-track truck. Despite multiple attempts, Allied forces on the ground couldn't locate it. Decades later, as portions of the River Po began to dry out, the vehicle was discovered in the riverbed. It appears as if German troops pushed it into the river rather than letting it fall into Allied hands. Number 8. The discovery of LCT-326. In late January 1943, a flotilla of landing craft set sail from Scotland to Devon in southwest England. The winter weather was foul, the waters choppy. On the night of February 1st, landing craft LCT-326 was reported missing off the coast of the Isle of Man. In 2020, researchers discovered the wreck of the LCT-326 off the coast of Bardsley Island. The island, a tiny strip of land off the coast of Wales, is 100 miles from the purported crash zone. The cause of the wreck is still unknown. Theories range from bad weather to a sea mine. In either case, the families of the boat's 14 crewmen can now get a measure of peace knowing its final resting place. Number 7. The USS Albacore. This Gato Fleet submarine sank 13 Imperial vessels during her time in the Pacific Theater in World War II, then vanished without a trace in 1944.
In 1944, Moss's parents received a telegram saying their son was missing. He was aboard the USS Albacore. The following year, another letter presuming him and about 85 others on the submarine lost.
The sinking of the aircraft carrier Taiho in particular made the Albacore a highly esteemed sub, adding to the Navy's dismay at her disappearance. In early 2023, researchers from the University of Tokyo pointed the U.S. Navy to a wreck off the coast of Hokkaido.
Saying with the help of a Japanese professor, the USS Albacore was identified.
In February, an unmanned Navy vessel was able to confirm the remains of the Albacore. She likely hit a mine while on a routine mission to refuel, losing all 85 people on board. Number 6. The disappearance of Wing Holm. An Army private from Boston who went MIA fighting the Germans in Italy. Holm and his squad were in a firefight south of Rome when he disappeared. He was never reported as a POW, and his body was never recovered.
A Private Holm was assigned to Company B, 7th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division.
At the end of the war, the Army listed Holm as killed in action. After almost 80 years, a set of remains found 3 miles west of the battle were disinterred. The POW MIA accounting agency performed a DNA analysis of the remains in 2021.
The Department of Defense says that the remains of U.S. Army Private Wing Holm of Boston, who was 20 years old at the time that he went missing, was accounted for on April 6th.
After confirming his identity, Private Holm was brought home and buried in October 2023. Number 5. The missing sailor from the USS Indianapolis. After its top-secret mission delivering the components for a nuclear bomb, this Navy cruiser was sunk by the Japanese.
In less than 15 minutes, the USS Indianapolis disappears beneath the waves. Nearly 300 men go down with the vessel.
Almost 900 men went into the sea, and famously, only 316 survived the dehydration, shark attacks, and exposure to the elements long enough to be rescued.
After 4 days of hell, a Navy plane on a routine patrol spots an oil slick on the ocean surface. Descending to investigate, the pilot is stunned to see hundreds of sailors drifting amongst the waves. He immediately radios for help.
Among those assumed to have perished was radio tech Clarence William Donner, since he was listed as a crewman on the Indianapolis and wasn't rescued. But in reality, Donner was alive and served until he was discharged in 1946. A clerical error had listed him as a crewman when he had actually just hitched a ride once to his billet. It took 73 years for historians to finally and conclusively set the record straight. Number 4. Finding Heaven Can Wait. The B-24 bomber was utilized by every branch of the U.S. military during World War II, and it played a central role in bombing campaigns in the Pacific Theater.
Heaven Can Wait and 2 other U.S. planes were headed toward the second of 2 targets near New Guinea when they encountered enemy fire. Heaven Can Wait was struck and fell to the water.
The family of 2nd Lieutenant Thomas V. Kelly Jr. mourned the disappearance of his B-24, nicknamed Heaven Can Wait, for 70 years. Then, in 2013, one of his relatives discovered a website with information about his plane.
On Memorial Day in 2013, Sandy's son, Scott, began the lengthy process of learning more about what happened to the B-24, Heaven Can Wait.
The family spent 5 years working with researchers, and Project Recover, along with the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, went to work searching for the wreck. Utilizing new technologies and advanced unmanned submersibles, oceanographers found the wreckage of Heaven Can Wait in 2018.
Just knowing it was there and finally found was huge news for the families of the servicemen who were lost.
Number 3. Family letters discovered in Toronto. Fans of Antique Roadshow know that every once in a while, old mysteries are solved in the nooks and crannies of old homes. Toronto contractor Dave Smart was working behind a furnace when he discovered a box full of World War II-era love letters.
When I first picked them up, I kind of thought, when I had a chance to think about it, that they should go back to some family.
They were correspondence between Amy Gorman Whitley and her husband Arthur. Smart spent several years as an online sleuth trying to hunt down their family.
I'm glad I've spent the time, and I'm glad they're now going to, we'll say, worthwhile.
The story went viral on local news outlets, prompting a community effort to find the family. Thanks to their work and Ancestry.com, the letters finally made it home to their relative, Scott Gorman, in 2020.
So it'll be great for us to learn so much about the Gorman family that we never knew about before.
Number 2. The missing crew of the Lady Be Good. This B-24 bomber fought in the Mediterranean, and on April 1943, the plane and her crew disappeared on their way to an airbase on the Libyan coast. In 1958, geologists with a British oil company discovered a wreck while flying over the Libyan desert. It was the Lady Be Good, though there was no sign of her crew. The U.S. military searched for their remains for months. They were finally discovered in 1960, many miles from the crash. It appears that after overshooting their destination, the crew bailed when the plane ran out of fuel. Miles from the wreck, they attempted to traverse the desert. A handful made it almost 85 miles before eventually succumbing to thirst. Number 1. Glenn Miller's plane crash. One of the most well-known and beloved bands in America in the early 1940s, the Glenn Miller Orchestra had reached the pinnacle of fame. But its leader felt a sense of civic duty, so he joined the military to bolster the troops' morale with music. 10 days before Christmas in 1944, Miller was aboard a transport plane en route to Paris when it disappeared over the English Channel.
It's gone. Yeah, he takes off from an air base in England on the way to Paris, and his plane just vanishes. Presumably it crashes into the English Channel, but you know what? Nobody ever found the plane.
Historian Dennis Sprague spent 5 years combing through military records to find the truth about why the plane crashed. Eventually, a diary found on Antiques Roadshow provided the final clue. The engines of Miller's small transport plane likely iced over while it was flying low after diverting 40 miles out of the way.
The airplane turns nose down, and in 8 seconds it's in the water.
Just as simple as that.
Yes.
Get ready, because we're about to crack into some of history's boldest robberies and look at how they were finally solved.
In order to get this guy, we needed the help of the community. We needed somebody to call in with information, something that they had seen or heard.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're counting down the most dramatic heists of financial institutions that were initially tough to crack, but which were solved after an extended amount of time or in unexpected ways.
With so little evidence to go on, the police and the FBI knew that the crime of the century might never be solved.
Number 10. The United California Bank Burglary. The United California Bank Burglary occurred in a city in California named Laguna Niguel. On March 24, 1972, a group of thieves broke into the bank's vault by blowing its concrete roof with dynamite. They walked out with $9 million in cash and valuables, the modern equivalent of $63 million. The robbery went unsolved for several months. That is, until a very similar theft occurred in Ohio.
Agents review the intelligence gathered on the 6 members of the burglary group. All have long records for home and small business burglaries.
First suspect we're going to look
and have done little jail time.
The FBI was able to link the two robberies, identifying the group and finding the townhouse they used as headquarters. They found fingerprints on the dishwasher, and with that, the robbers were identified and arrested. One of the burglars, a man named Charles Brockle, testified against his conspirators and went into witness protection.
In exchange for his full cooperation in outlining the burglary group and their crimes, prosecutors will drop all charges against Brockles and place him in the witness protection program. He agrees.
Number 9. The Wołów Bank Robbery. The People's Republic of Poland was rocked by a high-profile bank robbery on August 19, 1962. 6 men robbed the National Bank of Poland of 12.5 million złotych, making it the largest bank robbery in the country's history. While a staggering amount of money, it was all in specific print runs of 100 and 500 notes, prompting the Polish government to monitor those bills. And this worked. One woman soon attempted to deposit 18,000 złotych in a bank using some of that run of 100 and 500 bills, prompting the teller to call the police. And then later another woman tried paying for a luxury carpet with a $500 bill. Both instances led to an investigation, which in turn helped eventually lead to the arrests of the robbers. Number 8. The Dunbar Armored Robbery. It's amazing how often stupid mistakes lead to capture, like the aforementioned paying for a carpet in marked bills, or say giving a real estate broker a stack of cash inside a currency strap.
We were able to later determine the paper type wrappers actually came from some of the money stolen from the armored car company.
Alan Pace orchestrated the historic Dunbar Armored Robbery, which occurred in Los Angeles on September 12, 1997. Pace and 5 others robbed the Dunbar Armored Facility of $18.9 million in cash, making it the largest cash robbery in American history.
In less than 10 minutes, they wheeled millions to the loading dock.
They drove off into the night and remained free for over 2 years. But then, one of the robbers, Eugene Hill, paid a real estate broker with cash bound in their original currency straps.
Hill stored a trunk filled with smaller boxes. He gave one of the boxes to the informant. It contained cash, still bundled by bank wrappers, totaling $100,000.
The broker called the police. Hill was arrested, and he went on to name everyone involved. Number 7. The Aguila Blanca Heist. Before the Dunbar Armored Robbery, it was the Aguila Blanca that held the record for the largest cash heist in American history, meaning White Eagle in English. Aguila Blanca occurred on September 12, 1983, with a Connecticut Wells Fargo depot being emptied of $7 million.
A guard gave co-workers a knockout drug and stole $7.2 million. Agents in San Juan note that the guard in the so-called Big Sleep heist is Puerto Rican.
The crime was perpetrated by a Puerto Rican militant group dubbed Los Macheteros. An extensive investigation tracked those responsible, who remained on the lam for nearly 2 years.
And now, with the context in mind that this could be the armored car robbery, it started to make sense. The Macheteros had committed this robbery. They hadn't claimed responsibility for it yet, though.
Most of the suspects were arrested on August 30th, 1985, with leader Juan Palmer eventually being given a 65-year prison sentence. One of the members, Victor Herrera, remains free and spent 32 years on the FBI's top 10 most wanted fugitives list.
Inside man Victor Herrera remains the lone person still free, believed to be living in Cuba.
Number 6. Herman Lamm's robberies. This actually isn't just one bank robbery, but many, and they were all conducted by a German immigrant named Herman Lamm. Lamm is considered a trailblazer in the field of bank robbery, influencing the likes of John Dillinger through his famous Lamm technique. When it comes to casing a joint before a major robbery, criminals have Lamm to thank, as he devised the idea. Lamm and his gang were considered the most successful bank robbers of the 1910s and 20s, stealing more than $1 million from dozens of institutions around the country. But just when the authorities were starting to put the story together, Lamm botched a robbery on December 16, 1930, and took his own life rather than be captured. Number 5. The Nokas Heist. We again travel across the Atlantic, this time to Norway. The country's largest heist occurred on April 5, 2004, when a large group of heavily armed men raided Nokas cash handling. This was not a quiet robbery, as the gang used automatic weapons, smoke grenades, and vehicle spike strips to fight off the responding police. An officer was killed in the shootout, and the gang walked away with the equivalent of $10 million. The case went unsolved for about a year before 13 men were charged in 2005. Sentencing was handed down on March 10, 2006, with the men receiving a cumulative prison term of 181 years. Number 4. The Bank of Australia robbery. Needless to say, it wasn't easy to catch criminals in 1828. The first bank robbery in Australia took place on September 14th of that year, with 5 men robbing the Bank of Australia in Sydney. The criminals dug a sewage tunnel straight into the vault and took off with a huge fortune, leaving the bank's employees none the wiser. The crime went unsolved for 2 years, until one of the men, William Blackstone, came clean to the authorities. Blackstone informed on his partners in crime, resulting in 2 convictions. The other 2 did not face punishment, as one was already dead and the other had fled Australia. Number 3. Johnny Williams robberies. Considered America's most prolific bank robber, Johnny Williams stole from 56 savings and loans institutions between 1986 and 1993. One of his robberies took place in Solana Beach, California in 1987, when he stole $920 from a drive-thru and shot his gun into the ceiling. This act resulted in his nickname the Shootist, and he would go on to rob many more places with his wife and getaway driver Carol.
Williams' wife, Carol, bought a .38 revolver like the one in bank security footage. And Carol drives a red 4-door, registered in her maiden name.
His most profitable robbery also took place in 1987, when he got away with a haul of $43,500. But Williams' undoing came in 1993, when an accomplice turned him in for a reward.
Yet it wasn't just the agents and officers working the case who solved it.
Many times it's the assistance of the public that leads to the capture and successful resolution of these cases.
He was sentenced to decades in prison, but was released for health reasons in 2021. Number 2, the Society National Bank robbery. Many bank robberies are inside jobs, and Ohio's Society National Bank case is one of them. On July 11, 1969, a teller named Theodore Conrad put $215,000 inside a paper bag and just walked out.
That case began on Friday, July 11, 1969, when a 20-year-old Ted Conrad left his job at Society National Bank like normal, but was actually carrying over $200,000 with him in a paper bag. Then, almost like magic, vanish.
This incident occurred on a Friday night, and Conrad was already long gone when the bank became aware of the missing money the following Monday. Conrad moved to Massachusetts and began a new life as Thomas Randall.
To finally track down Conrad, who was living under the name Thomas Randell in Massachusetts, marshals don't believe he ever did anything like this again, and instead was married in 1982, had a daughter, and took up a pretty uneventful life.
U.S. Marshals didn't crack the case until 2021, when they matched paperwork filled out by Theodore Conrad in the 60s and Thomas Randall in the 2010s. However, Conrad had since died of lung cancer, making him the rare bank robber to have gotten away with it.
Investigators were able to match documents Conrad had completed in the 60s with documents Randell completed, including ones when he filed for bankruptcy in 2014. Randell died of cancer in May of this year.
Number 1, the Great Brinks robbery. The name Brinks is synonymous with security, yet one of their buildings was robbed of nearly $2.8 million on January 17, 1950. It was the largest robbery in American history at the time, and it remained unsolved for years. And it might have remained unsolved if it wasn't for robber Joseph O'Keefe. O'Keefe eventually had a falling out with the rest of the group, claiming he was never given his full portion of the money.
The gang started to crumble. O'Keefe accused Pino of cheating him out of his share of the money and made threats to the men if he didn't get his due.
After a wild series of convictions and kidnappings, another member, Anthony Pino, then tried to have O'Keefe killed. Eventually, he ratted on his accomplices and had them arrested just 5 days before the statute of limitations was set to expire.
It was a disappointing victory. After spending 6 years and $29 million on the investigation, they recovered a measly $51,000.
What do you think was the craziest robbery mystery?
Because I spend all my time chasing guys like you around the block. That's my life.
There are plenty of strange puzzles from the past that are likely never to be solved. However, these upcoming medieval times mysteries are not some of them.
There's a match.
Wow.
Blimey! The DNA evidence points to this being Richard III.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're counting down our picks for the most mysterious medieval events or discoveries that have modern explanations, or at least theories.
Photography meant that the image of the shroud could travel far and wide, and interest in it began to grow around the world.
Number 7. The Dancing Plague of 1518. Dancing can be a lot of fun, but how about dancing for days until you died? As bizarre as it sounds, the Dancing Plague of 1518 was an event in Strasbourg, modern-day France, where between 50 and 400 people reportedly danced uncontrollably for weeks. There are a few theories that might explain the event. The first is that it was the result of stress-induced mass hysteria, caused by hardship and superstition. An alternative theory is that it was a severe case of food poisoning from contaminated grain carrying ergot fungus. This poisoning could have produced powerful hallucinations, convulsions, and spasms. Number 6. The disappearance of the Greenland Vikings. In the 9th century, Norse Icelanders settled on Greenland's southwestern coast. It was a harsh environment, but they managed to eke out a living.
He spread the word of this new land that he has discovered, and he called it Greenland as a way of attracting people to come there and settle with him.
A few hundred years later, the ancestors of the Greenlandic Inuit also settled on the chilly island. But sometime after the 14th century, the Greenland Vikings disappeared, while the Inuit survived. There are several possible causes. One is the Little Ice Age, a period of regional cooling around that time. Another is the Black Death. While the Black Death didn't reach Greenland, it could have disrupted trade with Europeans, which the Norse relied on for essential goods.
We think this is a potential here for causing catastrophic loss of life in Greenland.
Trade could also have been impacted by the declining value of ivory, due to an influx of ivory into Europe from Russia and Africa. Number 5. The Buxton Man. The Buxton Man is an incredibly well-preserved body of a young man found in a Swedish peat bog in 1936. The mystery of his discovery focused on when and how this man died. Modern forensic analysis has since determined that he was between 25 and 35 years old and lived in the 14th century. Based on the hood he wore, he may have had high social standing. The evidence suggests he was brutally murdered, struck 3 times on the head and thrown into the bog. His body had been impaled with wooden poles to keep it from resurfacing. Why, however, remains a mystery. Number 4. The Vinland Map. While this isn't actually from medieval times, it was initially purported to be.
At this stage, the map is bound up with another document. A handwritten copy of a book by a 13th century explorer.
First circulated in 1957, the Vinland Map was supposedly a 15th century world map featuring Africa, Asia, Europe, and part of North America labeled Vinland.
There's no denying that it says something extraordinary. That only 50 years before Columbus, somebody knew of the new land that the Vikings had found.
This map raised major questions about whether the Vikings could have had knowledge of North America before Christopher Columbus. We now know that they did, thanks to excavations in the 1960s of a Norse settlement on the island of Newfoundland. But in 2018, the Vinland Map was identified as a forgery, thanks to careful study of the ink and parchment.
Is about more than reading the words. It's reading the parchment and the ink and the 100 tiny signs which tell you where a document has been.
It had in fact been created in the 20th century. Number 3. The Shroud of Turin. Purportedly the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. The Shroud of Turin has been an object of controversy ever since it emerged in 14th century France.
The Shroud of Turin is this amazing relic. At bottom, it's a piece of cloth. It shows a very faint sort of image of a crucified man. And the crucified man calls us to remember Jesus' death and resurrection.
The Bible talks about the burial cloths. All 4 of the Gospels mention that Jesus was taken down from the cross. He was wrapped in linen, and then his body was put in the tomb.
Although denounced as a forgery soon after, it's been preserved and revered in Turin Cathedral, Italy. In 1988, scientists employed radiocarbon dating techniques on the shroud's fibers, determining its origin to be between 1260 and 1390 AD.
A group of scientists were able to get permission to get a sample from the shroud and to subject it to radiocarbon dating. And then they announced with a 95% degree of certainty that the shroud was medieval.
This placed the shroud squarely in the Middle Ages, indicating it was likely not the burial cloth of Christ, but rather a product of medieval craftsmanship. While there are still those of faith who choose to believe that the shroud covered Jesus, science contends that it's a medieval forgery.
The shroud can never replace faith. I don't think we can ever know for sure whether the shroud is absolutely authentic because we don't have the DNA of Jesus to match it up with something that we might extract from the shroud itself.
Now, the Vatican does not have a position on the shroud's authenticity. However, a previous Pope wrote the shroud was, quote, a truly mysterious image which no human artistry was capable of producing.
Number 2. King Richard III's lost remains. For centuries, the whereabouts of King Richard III's final resting place remained a medieval mystery. Having died in the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, he was buried in Greyfriars Church.
Back in 2012, thanks to funding from the Richard III Society, they decided to try and find their king, believed buried on the former site of the Greyfriars Church, but it had long since been destroyed. On the very first day, digging for mere hours on a renewed hunt for Richard's remains, they stumbled on the king. At least they thought it was him. There was the telltale curvature of the spine.
However, the exact location of the church and his grave were lost due to King Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century. The enigma came to an end in 2012 when archaeologists uncovered a skeleton beneath the asphalt of a humble parking lot in Leicester, England.
It was an extraordinary discovery that stunned all of us.
It was enough to attract the attention of the world press, and the one king's suspected remains were destined to make Dr. King famous.
The remains were identified as the long-lost king during DNA analyses, comparing the DNA against that of Richard III's descendants.
Michael is the missing genetic royal link to King Richard III they were looking for.
I am a 17th generation nephew.
So that's nephew 17 times removed?
Yes, yeah.
It was through his mother Joyce that the mitochondrial DNA link was found.
This breakthrough not only solved the centuries-old puzzle of the long-lost monarch, but also revealed the lost location of the Greyfriars Church. Number 1. The cause of the Black Death. For centuries, the causes of the Black Death, a catastrophic epidemic that struck Western Eurasia and North Africa in the 14th century, were unknown.
After trade routes brought plague from Asia, where it killed millions in China and the Middle East, the disease wiped out about a third of Europe's population, earning itself the moniker, the Black Death.
Peaking in the late 1340s and early 50s, it killed an estimated 75 to 200 million people. At the time, people struggled to make sense of what must have seemed truly apocalyptic, suggesting that a conjunction of planets had released bad air or that it was just God's will.
For most of human history, the cause of illnesses, germs, was unknown, making sicknesses like the plague a mystery. This lack of knowledge drove the spread of disease as recently as the 19th century. Outbreaks in northwest India eventually reached major port cities in China. In just over a century, plague was exported throughout the globe and caused outbreaks in every continent except Antarctica.
We now know that the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted by fleas on black rats, was to blame. This discovery resolved a long-standing mystery about this medieval pandemic's source. Today, the infection is treatable with antibiotics. Are there any medieval mysteries you'd like answers to?
Since the Vinland map first surfaces in 1957, our evidence supports the assertion that other investigators have made that it was created at some point between the 1920s and the mid-1950s. The presence of barium sulfate in the anatase may mean that at least some of an earlier form of commercially available titanium white was used to prepare the ink. It has been suggested that the titanium on the map is attributable to the presence of anatase in naturally occurring titanium-rich clays.
Prepare to be captivated with our final video today, 30 of the creepiest mysteries that have finally been put to rest.
A 50-year-old mystery was recently solved when a group of intellectuals decoded a message from the Zodiac Killer.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're counting down our picks for the most unsettling mysteries that finally received answers.
But in 1937, a new written account is found, and it's a bombshell.
Number 30, the Long Island serial killer. It was one of the most absorbing mysteries of the early 21st century. Who killed all those women in New York? The Long Island serial killer murdered at least 11 victims since the early 1990s and disposed of most of their bodies throughout the Gilgo Beach area.
4 of them now officially listed as victims of this serial killer that's been dubbed the Long Island Ripper.
The killings remained a mystery until the summer of 2023, when a 59-year-old architect named Rex Andrew Hewerman was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder.
This is the man police have taken into custody.
DNA has officially linked Hewerman to many of the victims. As of June 2024, he's been charged with 6 of the murders and is currently pleading not guilty.
His court-appointed attorney entering a not guilty plea on his behalf.
Number 29, the burial place of Richard III. Mysterious deaths will always be intriguing and a little creepy, especially when they involve someone as famous as Richard III. The King of England was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, making him the final English king to die in battle.
Conducted with conspicuous bravery, Richard became the last King of England to die on the battlefield.
And then we just sort of forgot where he was. Oops. Richard's body was buried in the Greyfriars Church in Leicester, but the tomb was lost and erased from history when the church was demolished in 1536. Time passed on, a king was lost, and the old church grounds were turned into a parking lot. But it was in this parking lot that Richard was finally found in 2012, 476 years after his tomb was turned to rubble. Number 28, the case of Margie Jelovic. While working at her mother's Indiana tavern, Margie Jelovic met a biker named Randy Yeager, who rode with a gang called the Outlaws.
What's your name? I haven't seen you here before.
My name's Margie.
Margie, how do you do? My name's Randy.
The gang was reportedly incredibly violent and under numerous investigations for the likes of racketeering, robberies, and even various bombings and murders. Jelovic devoted herself to and defended Yeager, becoming paranoid that the police were after them. In September of 1997, she up and vanished.
Wherever she is gone, she has not traveled there in her car. Her family is as perplexed as they are worried.
Her asthma inhaler was left behind, suggesting that she had been taken against her will. But that was not the case. It wasn't until October of 2014 that Jelovic and Yeager were found living together in Mexico. Unfortunately, Jelovic was killed while driving away from the police. Yeager was caught and given a 15-year prison sentence.
Yeager has been on the run since 1997.
Number 27, the disappearance of Stardust. Airplanes simply up and disappearing will always be a disturbing subject. A famous case occurred on August 2, 1947, when a plane named Stardust vanished while flying from Argentina to Chile.
Then the plane sent one final mysterious Morse code message. Stendek.
The plane never arrived at the airport, and a search and rescue operation ended in failure when they couldn't locate the aircraft. It was simply gone.
After that, nothing more was heard from the plane.
And it would remain missing for over 5 decades. After years of conspiracy theories, the wreck of Stardust was found by 2 mountaineers in Mount Tupungato in the late 90s. Further study seemed to show that the pilots likely became mistaken about their location, having encountered a jet stream, and accidentally flew into the cloud-obscured mountain. The crash then started an avalanche, which buried the plane and prevented rescuers from finding it.
After the devastating crash, Stardust was buried within seconds.
Number 26, young Monica Bonilla. The marriage of Guillermo and Rosemary Bonilla began to collapse after the murder of John Lennon in 1980. Not long after, Guillermo Bonilla began dressing and acting like Lennon, telling Rosemary that he was the reincarnated musician. On September 22, 1982, Rosemary finished work and came home to find nothing in it anymore, including furniture, belongings, Guillermo, and their young daughter Monica. Years later, an episode of Unsolved Mysteries told of the disappearance of one Nylene Marshall.
For over 7 years, Nylene's family has been trapped by the agony of not knowing what happened to her.
A school official in Vancouver contacted the producers, claiming that a student named Mary Ann Kelly may be the missing Marshall. The FBI investigated Kelly and discovered that she was not Nylene Marshall, but the also missing Monica Bonilla instead. She was safely returned to her mother, who called the bizarre coincidence God's will. Number 25, the Mary Celeste. It's probably the most famous ghost ship in North American history. On December 4, 1872, the Mary Celeste was found floating and abandoned off Western Europe. The boat was in fair condition, while both its cargo and the crew's belongings were mostly accounted for.
10 persons,
The captain, his family, and crew had vanished without trace.
While we're still not 100% sure what happened, many commentators believe that something very, very worrying had to have occurred.
The men found working charts, but not the ship's papers, nor her navigational instruments or maps.
The explosive theory is one of the most popularly accepted ones, carrying over 1,700 barrels of alcohol. It's likely that the barrels started seeping, causing either an intense smell of gas or a small pressure wave explosion that would have left behind no scorching or soot. Either way, it's likely that the captain ordered the crew into the yawl and, in a panic, failed to secure it to the boat. The ship then drifted away, leaving the men to die on the open ocean.
Now, with the help of an international team of experts, the true story of the Mary Celeste can finally be told.
Number 24, the Freeman arson. At 5:30 a.m. on the morning of December 30th, 1999, police were notified of a fire at the house of Danny and Kathy Freeman.
It's a cold, dark morning when the volunteer fire department is called to extinguish a devastating trailer fire.
Inside, they found the corpses of Kathy and Danny, both of whom had been shot. Missing was the Freemans' teenage daughter Ashley and Ashley's friend Laura Bible, who was sleeping over that night. The crime wasn't solved for nearly 20 years.
The girls literally fell off the face of the earth. There is no clothes, no phone calls, nothing.
In April of 2018, 66-year-old Ronnie Busick was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder, including those of Bible and Ashley Freeman. It's believed that Busick and 2 others, Warren Welch and David Pennington, both dead, killed the Freemans, torched their house, and kidnapped the teens. Busick pled guilty and served just 38 months of his 10-year sentence, thanks to, quote, good behavior.
He was sentenced to 10 years in prison and Friday morning was released.
Number 23. A Zodiac Cipher is finally cracked. The story of the Zodiac Killer continues to intrigue owing to his elusive nature and the bizarre ciphers he produced. The Zodiac made 4 of these cryptograms, and before 2020, only 1 had been solved. The first was quickly cracked back in 1969, but for the next several decades, the remaining 3 continued to stump even the most professional codebreakers. That is, until December 2020, when another cipher was solved by private citizens. Dubbed Z340, the puzzle was originally sent on November 8, 1969, and references the Zodiac's welcoming of death.
It reads in part, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me."
He claims that his new life will be an easy one in paradise, and that he is not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send him to paradise all the sooner.
There are still 2 remaining ciphers from Zodiac that have yet to be decoded.
Number 22, the Lost Roanoke Colony. One of America's biggest mysteries is also one of its simplest. A number of colonists settled in what's now North Carolina in 1585. This was known as the Roanoke Colony. Explorer John White left the colony in 1587, meaning to get more supplies in England.
White soon sailed back to England for much-needed supplies, but when he returned, he found the settlement eerily abandoned.
When he finally returned in 1590, having been delayed by war, the colony was gone, the only clue being the word Croatoan carved into the palisade. White deduced, likely correctly, that the colonists left for nearby Croatoan Island. While we don't know for sure, there is tons of circumstantial evidence showing that it's most likely the colonists moved out and assimilated with the local tribes, having lost hope of White's return.
They eventually make it to safety after a 500-mile journey to Georgia.
Indeed, the present-day Hatteras tribe considers themselves descendants of the lost Europeans.
Perhaps the colonists survived, and together with the Croatoan tribe, went on to thrive in their adoptive land.
Number 21. Dyatlov Pass. Avalanches seem to account for many mysteries. The 1959 Dyatlov Pass one has long been a famous one, with 9 hikers fleeing the safety of their tent in the dead of night and dying under puzzling conditions. Their deaths were initially attributed to a, quote, compelling natural force, and questions abounded for many decades.
And in the end, investigators are left with no explanation as to what happened.
But advancements in technology led to a sound answer in 2020, avalanche. It's likely the hikers heard the rumblings of an imminent avalanche and fled the tent in a panic. Further study suggests some got hit by a slab avalanche, hence their devastating physical injuries, and the rest got lost in the dark and passed on through hypothermia. This answer has been supported by numerous independent bodies, all of whom agree that it's the most likely scenario.
Being in this location
really brought home to me just how terrifying it was for them.
Number 20, the fate of the Franklin expedition.
I will not lose another man, Francis. We may lose all our men.
For centuries, explorers sought out a northwest passage between the Atlantic and Pacific through the Arctic Ocean, but their expeditions often ended in disaster.
It's the ice, Georgie. It's only the ice.
One of the most famous was British Royal Navy officer John Franklin's in 1845. His expedition's ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, never returned. Search parties recovered only artifacts and human remains. With the passing of time, however, we've pieced together the full story. The ships got trapped in pack ice, and the crew died from starvation, hypothermia, and disease. The sunken Erebus and Terror were finally found in 2014 and 2016, respectively. Number 19, Pierre Ail.
Some lumps of things come back that are not especially pleasant.
Imagine waking up in a ditch with only $17 in your pocket and no idea who you are or where you came from. That's what happened to amnesiac Pierre Ail in May 1992. Ail was found wandering the streets of San Diego and taken to a shelter. Pieces of his life started coming back to him, including faces and talents, but nothing came of his attempts to connect to his past life. In September, his case was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries.
I was so sure this city would bring everything back, and it did not.
This episode was seen by an old colleague of April's named Carol. She phoned the show's tip line and told them all they needed to know. April was happily reunited with his family, and his memory has since recovered.
It is strange to be told who you are and what you did. I'm someone again.
Number 18, Umbrella Man. The assassination of John F. Kennedy in November 1963 prompted countless conspiracy theories. Some of the more interesting ones were about a figure spotted in photos and films of the event, who had been brandishing an umbrella despite the sunny weather.
In all of Dallas, there appears to be exactly one person standing under an open black umbrella.
Could he have been complicit in the assassination? He remained a mystery for 15 years, until 1978, when Louis Stephen Witt came forth. Witt identified himself as the Umbrella Man and said that the umbrella was meant as a symbolic protest against Kennedy. An umbrella had been the trademark accessory of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, infamous for initially appeasing the Nazi Party.
It was a reference to Neville Chamberlain's umbrella.
And with that, one of the world's most tantalizing mysteries fizzled out with a disappointing answer.
Oh, I see. Then everything is wrapped up in a neat little package. Really, I mean that.
Number 17, the Paulding Light of Michigan. Speaking of horribly disappointing answers, let's discuss the Paulding Light.
We came out here because somebody had heard about it. We were just sitting around a night, and some local people that we knew had heard about this.
Paulding is a small community in western Michigan that houses a famous piece of folklore.
One popular legend says that the light is produced by the wayward spirit of a train conductor killed when his locomotive derailed.
Just outside of town, onlookers can spot a bright light flashing on and off at the end of a valley. The people of Paulding have many supernatural explanations for this light, including ghosts. One particularly creepy story claims that it's a grandparent looking for their lost grandchild with a flickering lantern. But the truth is far more boring. Turns out it's actually just headlights from a nearby highway. So, yeah, bummer.
Had people standing here having the pictures of the vehicles on the screen of the computer, and it's like, well, that's it, and they still won't believe it.
Number 16, the Somerton Man. One of Australia's enduring mysteries may have been finally solved in the summer of 2022. On December 1st, 1948, a body was found in Adelaide's Somerton Park. He was wearing American clothes embroidered with the name Keane. Inside his pocket was a scrap of paper reading Tamam Shud, Persian for is finished. The book that this paper was torn from was eventually located, and investigators found cryptic text written on the cover.
We looked for people with no date of death on that tree, and there was one that stood out.
In July 2022, DNA helped identify the man as Carl Webb. It's also now believed that the cryptic text found in the book were the names of horses, as Webb often gambled on horse racing. And finally, the clothes were likely passed down from his nephew, who once lived in the United States. Number 15, the bloop. Many people have a fear of the deep ocean, and it's because of things like this. The bloop was a very loud underwater noise captured in 1997 by the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It was so loud that it was detected by sensors over 3,000 miles away. It doesn't sound like much at normal speed, but it takes on its signature bloop noise when sped up. Believers in Cthulhu immediately went to giant underwater monster, but once again, the truth is more mundane. It wasn't a massive creature, but an ice quake as a result of glacial movements. Man, science can't let us have any fun. Number 14, Anastasia's fate.
In the grave, there was supposed to be 11 bodies, but only 9 were there.
On July 17, 1918, far-left revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, murdered the Russian Imperial Romanov family. In the aftermath, rumors circulated that Grand Duchess Anastasia, who was 17, had somehow escaped and survived. Her body could not be located, and several people came forward claiming to be the lost Anastasia. However, these stories turned out to be outright lies or the result of mental health issues, as was the case with famous imposter Anna Anderson. The long-standing rumor was officially put to rest when the remains of the royal family were identified with DNA. Grand Duchess Anastasia was among them, proving that she died with the rest of the Romanovs. Number 13, Lady Be Good. The World War II bomber Lady Be Good was used to conduct a raid on Naples on April 4, 1943. However, it disappeared on its way back to Libya, and both the plane and its crew were considered lost. No one knew what happened, and the plane was not recovered. That is, until 1958, when the crashed aircraft was spotted in the Libyan desert. This raised even more questions, as the plane was remarkably preserved and showed no signs of the crew.
Where's the pilot? I don't understand! Where's the crew? Hey!
All the questions were subsequently answered after an investigation. The pilots had gotten lost in a sandstorm and ejected from the craft when it ran out of fuel. The plane crashed, and the men died while walking through the desert. Number 12, sailing stones. It's one of the most bizarre sights that can be seen in nature. A lone rock stands in the middle of the desert. A massive trail snakes behind it, as if it's been pushed across the ground. However, no footsteps and no signs of animal activity can be found. These stones are especially notable in the racetrack playa of California's Death Valley.
All these funny parallel trails that are clearly there's some sort of common force involved.
So just what the heck is going on with these rocks? The phenomenon has tantalized researchers for decades, but the mystery has only recently been cracked. The valley floor produces a very thin layer of ice, and the rocks slide across these sheets when the ice starts to melt. The movement leaves indentations in the ground, resulting in their signature trails. Number 11, the death of Jun Lin.
His mother still worried about him living in a big foreign city, so he'd walk the streets with his cell phone and stream images back to her. His message to her in their daily conversations was always the same. Don't worry, he told her. I'm safe.
One of the most notorious videos in the history of the internet was uploaded on May 25, 2012. Titled One Lunatic, One Ice Pick, it depicts an Asian male getting killed and dismembered by an unidentified figure.
So you could see that clearly the murder happened on the bed.
Various body parts were then sent to schools and federal offices across Canada, and these remains were linked to the man who was killed in the video. The case made international headlines and remained a mystery for several days. But investigators quickly traced the grisly homicide to a man named Luca Magnotta, who had already fled the country. An international manhunt ensued, and Magnotta was finally captured in Berlin on June 4th, about a week and a half after uploading the infamous video.
Luca Magnotta, who's been the focus of an international manhunt since fleeing Canada last week, was arrested by police at an internet
He will eventually face Canada's justice system. He's expected to go before a judge tomorrow.
Number 10, the face on Mars.
Was there once an advanced civilization on Mars? Some of the features on the planet's surface definitely make you wonder.
This is one of the most popular space images of all time. Taken by the Viking orbiters back in the mid-70s, the picture depicts the Cydonia region of Mars. People immediately noticed that one of the features bore a striking resemblance to a human face, or maybe one of those old-school hockey masks.
Everything is proportional. If the face is 1.5 miles, 2 miles long, the eyes 1/4 mile, nose about 1/2 mile. So it's not small structure, it's very large structure.
Speculation immediately flew to aliens or some kind of human habitation on the supposedly barren planet. But nah, the answer is much more boring. Turns out this was just an optical illusion, the result of lighting, angle, and a low-resolution picture. More recent and much better photos have been taken of the same location, and they reveal nothing but a boring hill with face-like characteristics. Number 9. The construction of the pyramids. The Giza pyramids are arguably the most famous landmarks in the world. They continue to stand tall literally after thousands of years. Their construction has baffled people for millennia, leading some to suggest that aliens must have been involved. After all, humans couldn't possibly drag and lift those stones into place, right? Well, yes, they could. Researchers believe that workers loaded the blocks onto sledges and wet the sand to make them easier to drag. They raised the blocks using ramps and levering techniques. This took tens of thousands of people decades to complete. But hey, no one said building a wonder of the world was easy. Number 8. The Tunguska event. In the early morning of June 30th, 1908, a remote area of Russia was hit with a massive and mysterious blast.
In 1 hour, the explosion and the great fire that followed destroy a region of forest the size of Greater London.
People who observed that thought the end of the world had come, Judgment Day, divine intervention.
This blast completely leveled over 800 square miles of forest and flattened 80 million trees. No source could be found for the explosion, so no one knew what exactly happened.
It's an event and it's a mystery that would take 105 years of research before we could finally write the words. The end.
Thousands of scientific papers have been written about the incident, and the area has been studied for decades, with many trying to crack the bizarre case. It is now generally agreed that a 200-foot meteor traveling 60,000 miles per hour exploded in midair over the area, resulting in what's called a meteor airburst. This airburst then leveled everything below the meteor's detonation site.
If it was a meteorite and the Earth had turned a bit further, it would have destroyed St. Petersburg. An hour later, it would have destroyed Helsinki. 1 hour later, Stockholm, and after that, Oslo.
Number 7. The death of Ryan Stallings. Patricia Stallings brought her sick baby Ryan to the hospital. The doctors found what they thought was ethylene glycol in the baby's blood, leading them to conclude that he had been poisoned. He recovered, but Patricia was suspected of the poisoning, and Ryan was sent to live elsewhere.
And I was devastated. I was blown away. I just could not believe that they could even think. I mean, Ryan was my world.
Following a future visit, Ryan fell sick again and died. Patricia was again blamed for poisoning Ryan and charged with homicide.
His mother, Patty, was now charged with first-degree murder and held without bail. She was not allowed to attend Ryan's funeral.
She later gave birth to another son, and he exhibited the same symptoms. It was later found that both children suffered from a disorder called methylmalonic acidemia. An acidic byproduct of the disorder can be mistaken for ethylene glycol.
It would be very simple to confuse the diagnosis of MMA with multiple poisonings because the symptoms are very similar.
Patricia was released from prison and successfully sued the lab that tested Ryan's blood. Number 6. Stonehenge.
The awe-inspiring stone circle is an enduring mystery. Despite centuries of intense scrutiny,
one of humanity's greatest marvels, Stonehenge has been standing for thousands of years.
The widely accepted theory is that the Stonehenge landscape was a large cemetery, a place to bury and worship the dead.
But where exactly did the giant stones come from? They're all pretty much symmetrical, 13 feet high, 7 feet across, and each weighing 25 tons. Experts have been trying to crack the case for hundreds of years. Some will have you believe that it was aliens, but no. It was really just the nearby woods. In 2019, researchers were able to do tests on a small area of extracted stone and sourced it to the nearby Westwoods in Wiltshire. The location has finally been pinned down, but one tantalizing question remains. How did they drag these 25-ton boulders 15 miles to the south?
Clearly some very, very powerful people around at that time who were being able to control resources, control the labor force, to create some of the largest monuments we've ever seen.
Number 5. The Centennial Olympic Park criminal.
The North Carolina mountains, ground zero for the largest, most expensive fugitive search in United States history.
On July 27, 1996, Atlanta's Centennial Olympic Park was bombed during the Summer Olympic Games. The blast injured hundreds, but thanks to the heroic efforts of security guard Richard Jewell, direct deaths were limited to 2 people.
Move away from the tower! Go toward the street, anything but here! Are you kidding me? We gotta move, there's a bomb!
Jewell himself was initially pegged as the culprit, but he was eventually cleared and the case remained a mystery for several years. The FBI was eventually led to a man named Eric Rudolph, who had committed various other bombings across the American South. Rudolph was finally arrested in 2003 and pleaded guilty to all charges. He was given 4 life sentences and is currently held in a supermax prison in Colorado.
He had 1 live bomb and 250 pounds of explosives buried in the mountains here. He agreed to tell the government where it all was in exchange for life sentences.
Number 4. The disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi.
Trump administration touched off a new storm of criticism over the killing of Saudi writer Jamal Khashoggi.
The U.S. has sanctioned some Saudis in response, but the Crown Prince has yet to face any punishment.
The case of journalist Jamal Khashoggi was all over the news in the fall of 2018. On October 2nd of that year, Khashoggi went missing while visiting the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. At the time, Khashoggi was living in exile as he was penning scathing articles that criticized the Saudi Arabian rulers.
And I think his knowledge of the regime added credibility to his profession as a journalist when he spoke out.
While his fate remained a mystery for weeks, most people had a good idea what happened. Khashoggi was killed inside the consulate. It was eventually revealed that Khashoggi did indeed die inside the building, and on October 25th, Saudi Arabia's Attorney General admitted that it was a premeditated homicide. The CIA later concluded that Khashoggi was assassinated on the orders of Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman.
There was credible evidence that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and other Saudi senior officials were liable for the killing.
Number 3. The Golden State Killer. One of the most notorious criminals in American history, the Golden State Killer has gone by many names. He terrorized California throughout the 70s and 80s, sexually assaulting at least 51 women, burglarizing over 100 homes, and murdering 13 people. He was given different names in different areas, including the Visalia Ransacker and the Night Stalker. Only with time did it become apparent that these crime sprees were the work of one person. The name Golden State Killer was coined in 2013 by crime writer Michelle McNamara. The case helped inspire the creation of California's DNA database, and it was DNA evidence that eventually nabbed Joseph James DeAngelo in 2018, who by then was 72 years old. He was sentenced to life in prison.
I think we all had come to terms that we would never see justice in this case. Neither one of them in any way, shape, or form should have ever died this way.
Number 2. The collapse of the Maya civilization. The largest and most sophisticated pre-Columbian civilization of the Americas, the Maya flourished for thousands of years.
They mastered mathematics and astronomy, perfected the first written language of the Western Hemisphere, and produced stunning works of art.
The civilization entered its so-called classic period in the year 250, and this lasted until 900. It was around then that the entire political system collapsed, and the Maya abandoned their most important cities to move north. With this, the Maya civilization entered what is called its post-classic period. So what the heck happened? It's a mystery that has plagued historians for years. The answer was finally found in the 21st century. It turns out the Maya were so overpopulated that they damaged the environment and created a devastating drought.
The extreme intensity of these droughts was disastrous, making a carefully managed response their only hope.
With their agriculture thoroughly destroyed, the Maya were forced to abandon their most populous cities.
Today, the empty jungles of the Yucatan serve as a reminder that even great civilizations can fail.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into your settings and switch on notifications. Number 1. The Vampire Clan. One of the creepiest episodes of Unsolved Mysteries involves Rod Ferrell and his so-called Vampire Clan.
Ferrell and his clan reportedly liked to play vampire at various places around town. One favorite hangout was an abandoned building they called the Vampire Hotel.
In November of 1996, Jennifer Wendorf found her parents beaten to death inside their Florida home. The case went unsolved for weeks, although police immediately suspected Ferrell in the killing, as he was close to the Wendorf's other daughter, Heather. Ferrell was the leader of a Kentucky cult centered around vampirism, and allegedly had prospective members drink his blood in order to join.
That he would cut his arm and let others suck his blood as sort of some kind of ritualistic, they call it being embraced into the family.
The grandmother of a member helped police apprehend the cult, and both Ferrell and a man named Scott Anderson were found responsible for the Wendorf's deaths and given life sentences.
While the couple's daughter Heather was arrested along with Ferrell, Howard Scott Anderson, Dana Cooper, and Charity Kesey, all who were sent to prison. A grand jury believed Heather was unaware of the murder plot and she was not tried.
What do you make of these answers?
The Lancastrian's two massive main wheels are lying on the glacier just a few meters apart.
Well, that's going to do it for this special look at mysteries that have finally been unraveled. Thanks for watching. I've been Matt from Watch Mojo, and I'll see you next time.
Did you enjoy this video? Check out these other clips from Watch Mojo, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.